Wonderland. She's a very curious person. She also kind of drifts off into like this dream world sometimes, but she's also a very logical and reasonable person. And then the next character we have is the March Hare. He is a white rabbit with red beady eyes. He's very time bound. He does everything by his stopwatch, and he's kind of panicky, especially in the beginning. The next character we have is the Caterpillar. He's kind of seen as a wise character. He also makes Alice question a lot of things about herself later on. He's only 3 inches tall, and he smokes. Next character is Cheshire Cat. He has the ability to become invisible. He's a very mysterious character because he appears and reappears a lot, and he's also a very logical person. Then we have the Hatter, the Mad Hatter. Of course, he is mad, but through his riddles, he actually is creating logic to the story, and he's kind of a scattered person. He seems a little bit schizophrenic at times, but he's not. And then we have the King, who is seen as the opposite of the Queen. She is seen as kind of demanding and crazy, and he's kind of calm and reasonable. And then the last character we have is, of course, the Queen of Hearts, who is very irrational, mean, and her head is very huge, which reflects her giant ego, just because she's basically an insecure character. The story starts with Alice and her sister, and Alice's sister is actually reading her a book, and all of a sudden Alice sees this white rabbit, and she becomes really curious, so she starts to pursue the rabbit. And as she pursues the rabbit, she finds this big hole that she stumbles upon, and she ends up falling down the hole. So as Alice falls down the hole, there are a bunch of jars everywhere all over these shelves, and she begins to pluck the jars but realizes that all of them are actually empty. After Alice falls down the rabbit hole, she finds this hallway with a bunch of doors in it, and she realizes there's a really small door, but the only way to get to it is to have the key, which she sees on a glass table, but she's curious because she can't fit into the door, so she drinks this potion sitting on the table, thinking that she might shrink for it, and she does, but she forgets the key. So she finds this treat sitting on the ground because she's really small, and she eats the treat, but nothing happens at first. So then she notices the rabbit, and the rabbit is running away, but he left his gloves and a fan behind. So since she's really tired and frustrated, she fans herself and begins to shrink. So she's eventually able to catch up with the rabbit, but she ends up in this place called the Pool of Tears, where she finds a whole bunch of other animals and a rat specifically, and has this conversation that basically reflects the absurdity of English politics at the time, and her reasoning throughout this entire adventure as she's trying to find the rabbit reflects how Wonderland causes her to act emotionally instead of logically. So after the Pool of Tears, Alice continues on and she finds a caterpillar, and he's sitting smoking on a mushroom, and the first thing he says to her is, "Who are you?" And that causes her to question who she is, which is another major theme, is her kind of finding her own identity and herself throughout this entire story, because it's basically this Wonderland and nothing's logical, but it causes her to find logic in things. So after she visits the caterpillar, Alice finds the Cheshire Cat in a tree, and she asks him where she should go, and he suggests that he or she visits the Mad Hatter and the rabbit for a tea party, but she doesn't want to visit anybody that's mad, and he tells her if she's in Wonderland, she has to be mad too, which displays another theme of the story, that Wonderland basically represents irrationality of the world, and the word mad actually puns the word made, meaning all of this is kind of created in her own mind, and it reflects the fact that everything is kind of fabricated both in the real world, and Wonderland just reflects that fabrication. Alice takes the cat's advice, and she finds the Hatter and the rabbit having a tea party on this huge long table with just 3 people there, and then the Hatter kind of starts saying all these riddles to Alice, and it makes her frustrated and confused, But his riddles actually, even though his language doesn't seem like it, they actually propose some kind of logic to them. And basically the overall meaning of this scene is that the language they use kind of represents the inconsistency of the actual world that she lives in. So after Alice storms off from the tea party, she eventually is able to get the key and go through the garden. And the garden actually represents the heart of Wonderland, and Wonderland represents all the consistencies in the actual world. And when she arrives, there's the playing cards, who are servants to the Red Queen, or the Queen of Hearts, and their numbers are 2, 7, and 10, and they're basically painting the roses red, and it kind of shows how ironic the world can be sometimes, because if she wanted the red roses, then she could have just gotten red roses instead of them having to paint them red. So eventually the Queen arrives, and she starts getting upset at Alice because she doesn't know who she is, so she orders for her head to be chopped off, because she's always ordering for people's heads to be cut off. And once Alice gets an opportunity to kind of explain herself, and the king also calms her down, she invites her to a game of croquet. But this is an unusual game. It's played with flamingos and hedgehogs as their tools. And Alice is very confused in this scene because she starts to realize how difficult and strange Wonderland really is, and the Queen basically represents her fragile understanding of the world overall, not just in Wonderland but in the real world also. So in the end, Alice finds herself in court as a witness for a crime that occurs, and the Red Queen and all of the other characters from earlier in the story end up in court, and it's basically just kind of a madhouse. Everything's chaotic, nothing makes sense. The king constantly orders for a verdict, but nothing is actually made, no decisions are made. So it overall represents and kind of mocks the judicial system at the time that Alice was living in.